Very good. So I thought what we'd start off with is maybe just, you've had many, many years previously in your career as a politician. Maybe we can start off with sort of this idea of land planning. And in terms of what the Squamish Nation and what you've been involved in helping to mitigate climate change and thinking about that.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to our dear Elder Roberta for the welcoming this morning. And it's a real pleasure to be here with each of you to share our journey and our story. You know, as a recovering politician now, you know, being in politics for 23 years, I like to call it recreational suffering, but it was a tremendous opportunity to contribute and to be a part of some fantastic teams that really represent generations of effort. So I put it in context of really contact with European cultures in this part of the world is fairly recent, in the late 1700s, which really was dynamic throughout the 1800s with Fort Langley, with the burgeoning city of Vancouver here, and the intermarriages between settlers and our Indigenous women that really represented true reconciliation early on. We've seen the gold rush mentality of influx of settlers coming in, the get-rich-quick schemes, first of all, literally with the gold rush, with the collapse of forestry with old-growth forests, extirpation of resident species, that led to the collapse of the commercial salmon fisheries and wild salmon being in peril. That really then also led to land grabs, where we've seen preemption of our lands as early as the 1860s without Indigenous consent or compensation. So this really distorted relationships, hence why we are now in an era of reconciliation, because we've witnessed this pattern. Now oil, gas, and mining is the new drive for energy security globally, and we recognize the value of our lands in a global context. The affluence and quality of life that Canadians have enjoyed has directly been at the expense of Indigenous peoples in this country. So to mature as a society and to move forward, we must balance our canoe with Indigenous epistemologies paired with Western practices to make better outcomes.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. I thought maybe we'd start a little bit. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about some of the clean energy projects you've been involved in.
Yeah, so we did participate in 9 run-of-river hydroelectric projects. These were important to us when we did our land use planning. One of my first projects coming in back in 1999 was looking at Hereditary land use planning, where we wanted to remove ambiguity on what our vision is for sustainable use of our lands and resources. This was at a time when the province of BC was undertaking their own LRMP process, land and resource management planning, where the terms of reference for the province wouldn't entertain any new protected areas. They said they protected 12% of the park, I believe it was, under provincial parks. We said, that's great, we commend you, but you've never once included Squamish Nation on the attributes that are being protected or what co-management would entail. So we wanted to undergo our own land use planning. We didn't want to go cap in hand to some other level of government and say, please consider our interests and treat us as stakeholders. We wanted to exercise our jurisdiction, our authority, and our governance. So we ended up protecting 50,000 hectares of pristine wilderness, which represents about 8% of Squamish territory. These were the last non-roaded, non-industrial parts of our territory that we protected, what we call Sgsmåquyaq Quth, which is very hard to translate into English, so we settled on conservancies. We also did access management, restoration areas, wildlife management, along with the IPPs that became a part of that suite of what we felt we can achieve at that moment in time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I think I'd like to talk about one particular project, which is the wood fiber LNG project. And it was a very unusual or really interesting opportunity, the role that the Squamish Nation took in that you've actually developed a relationship in which you're going to be the regulator as part of that. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that process.
Yeah, I think it's important to qualify that project by really illustrating the challenges we had through the NEB process, the National Energy Board on Trans Mountain. So concurrently, while we were asking very important questions around Trans Mountain, such as why this location in Burrard Inlet, how does diluted bitumen interface with saltwater, how do you clean it up, what about extirpation of resident orcas? There was a number of questions we had that really weren't being answered in any real meaningful way of analysis, which led us to really oppose the project. Concurrently, we had the wood fiber proponents approached the Squamish Nation, where it was about relationship building. It wasn't transactional of ticking a box and saying we've consulted with the Indigenous group. It was really the Tenodo family from Malaysia coming to us and approaching the nation in a respectful way, where it really took a year and a half or 2 years to get to know each other, where, again, the nation didn't want to go cap in hand to government, especially in light of what we experienced through the NEB process. So similar to the land use planning, we decided to do our own independent environmental assessment. So this was a way of actualizing consent under United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and a principle within that is FPIC, which is free, prior, informed consent. So it's really looking at how do you garner consent from an Indigenous nations, where we created a process that had a start and a finish with a conclusion, where we make our decisions based off solid analysis that we can then defend whether we support or not, which then creates greater stability and certainty for the project to move forward. So that was innovative in a way that these were legally binding conditions, and it did position the nation as a regulator, which is the first of its kind in Canada that we know of.
Absolutely. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with the wood fiber site, it's up in Howe Sound, and it was historically one of 2 pulp mills in Howe Sound. And then because of economic reasons, it shut down, and then it's being transformed into a potential site for LNG. And one thing that's really exciting about that, so I've studied those sites in Howe Sound for 30 years. I'm a marine biologist. And so in the old days, when there was no enforcement of environmental regulations, it was very, very common to have spills and to have die-offs that were happening. And we've seen a resurgence of the marine life in Howe Sound since that mill closed. Other activities have happened with remediation in the estuary in Squamish. And maybe you could comment on some of the things that you and your nation have observed in Howe Sound for recovery since then.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, the impacts of industrialization throughout Burrard Inlet as well as Howe Sound really strained the ecosystem around food security for Squamish Nation. We couldn't practice our traditional sustenance where many species were being impacted. We've seen a dead zone in Howe Sound from the effluents of Britannia Mine, for example, where there's also mercury in the Squamish estuary. The pulp mills had effluents that were pouring into the Sound, wreaking havoc for many decades, where the nation was very proactive in holding government and proponents accountable to improve that situation, where we now have seen a revitalization of Howe Sound through the return of herring biomass, for example, which, a new entrant into market like LNG, getting product to Tidewater and creating an export facility really raised the anxiety amongst our membership to say, why should we support an industrial project like LNG? So the environmental assessment was integral to mitigating the risks through deep engagement and consultation with our members. That took place over a number of years. That then formed the 25 conditions. I was up on the project site last week, and we seen a pot of orcas go by, which was fantastic to see the volume of pink salmon that are in Mill Creek and Wood Fiber Creek as we speak right now. The project, we wanted to effect design changes, for example, to move the project from seawater cooling, which would have been heated and chlorinated and put back into Howe Sound with millions of gallons per day, to move the project to air cooling, for example. We avoided the Squamish River estuary through directional drilling. We removed compressor stations from our inhabited reserves and put them more into the rural sort of backcountry as some examples of how to mitigate some of the environmental risks.
Absolutely, and that example that you just illustrated, being able to get those concessions is a true leadership in the environmental field, because now other communities can look at that example and say, well, they managed to do it. We should be able to demand that as well. So I wanted to move on to a couple of the other projects that you've been involved in. When we talk to colleagues who are working with Indigenous nations, for example, when you held your conference last spring, the Indigenous Success Showcase, one thing that we heard again and again as speakers came up to talk was about how difficult it was to address the housing crisis on reserve land. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about the Sňwx project and the opportunities that brings to the community.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. So housing has definitely been a crisis nationally for Indigenous peoples. If you look at the Squamish context, the federal government, under the Indian Act of 1876, created the reserve system, and the federal government allocated 0.3% of our territory to Squamish Nation, which means 99.97% has been confiscated from us without, again, our consent or compensation. So this small pittance of land that we've been relegated to through marginalization and legislative oppression has been a real challenge, because we can't monetize reserve lands necessarily as members of the tribe. We can't go to financial institutes and borrow monies because there's no recourse for those lenders in case of default. So the nation has to provide guarantees and provide structures that have been very oppressive under federal legislation. So as we move that pendulum and move towards self-determination, we've had to create a number of policies within our own organizations to counter the paternalism of Ottawa, to really unlock the value of our lands. We recognize the value of our lands in a global context. Who and what we attract to this part of the world is substantive. So the nation does have a fantastic land portfolio, both on and off reserve, of lands that are in the queue for development, including Skszwx. So Skszwx is just over here in False Creek. It's an ancient village site that we were forcibly removed from in 1913. By 1900, our peoples were deemed as squatters here in Vancouver, which is just ironic to think that, it's almost like interlopers coming in and booting out the locals under the guise of saying we're squatters. So very challenging, because we had no legal recourse back then. Until about 1960, we couldn't protect ourselves from the onslaught of federal oppression. This is my parents' era, when we finally were able to own fee simple land. We're finally able to go to university. I'm the first generation out of residential schools in my family, so it's hard to call these schools. They're really internment camps designed to eradicate our language and culture, not conducive for academia or creating affluence in our communities. So a lot of formidable challenges that the nation has had to overcome through tenacity and resilience of our elders, who have maintained our language and our culture, our values. So as we, launched court action on Skszwx in 1977, it took us decades to fight the Crown on their systemic racism of their modus operandi of colonialism. We finally settled outside of court in 2003 with the reclamation of 10.68 acres in False Creek, and including that as additions to reserve. So we're now breaking ground to create 6,000 rental units in False Creek that aren't just for Squamish Nation members, they're for the general public. These are going to be beautiful buildings that are going to have fantastic views of the Salish Sea, excellent quality of life, with stability and certainty around rental, where we're mirroring a lot of the provincial standards of tenancy agreements, where the federal government doesn't occupy the field, the nation must. So we've developed a robust set of tools to attract investment on reserve and to provide amazing products like you're going to see at Skszwx.
Fantastic, thanks so much. Michelle had introduced earlier, Michelle Sklar, the theme of this conference, which is the intersection of addressing the climate emergency and public health emergencies. And housing comes down to one of those issues where there's an intersection. So often those of us that are most marginalized in the community often have poor access to sustainable housing. Often that housing, if it gets hot in the climate crisis, people are not able to find cool regimes. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what some of the sort of climate mitigation or sustainability aspects have been incorporated into the Skszwx project.
Yeah, certainly. One of the great things that when I did my MBA studies, I had access to Dr. Stephen Cornell from Harvard. And Cornell did a number of, 30 years of analysis of Indigenous nations in North America that are successful and that are engaged in big business. And, we really wanted to look at the attributes of these nations in their nation building or rebuilding ourselves and redefining ourselves, not as assimilated people, but as through adaptation. And one thing that stood out for me was not engaging in business for the sake of business, but it's really this notion of purpose and profit, doing business that meets our values and our principles, that finds solutions to formidable challenges, that create long-term sustainable revenues and assets that we can then reinvest back into our communities for things like housing, health, education, elders care, youth and recreation programs, and more importantly, language revitalization, things that other levels of government will never really pay for or assist us in. They're the ones that put us in these predicaments. So that whole notion of self-determination, of creating economies and scale of economy that can grow was really important. So within that, it really comes down to our values and thousands of years of our presence here in this part of the world. We have a special relationship to these lands. We have a cultural and spiritual relationship, which we find Western management practices has completely removed culture and spirituality when it comes to their vocabulary related to any resource or development project. So as we're new entrants in the market and we go forth in developing, it's not just to replicate any other building here in Vancouver. It's really to ensure that our signature is on it, that we create value chains for our people to participate in contract and procurement and long-term careers, and provide affordable housing for them to be able to live within our own communities and within our own territories. So of course innovation necessitates that we look at what are all the burgeoning areas of capturing water, of creating projects that are going to have better efficiency in a variety of ways. So I know we've worked with different proponents where we did RFPs through Ernst & Young to create real viable processes to select developers where there is value alignment. And that really allows us to truly partner with others within the community and create better outcomes.
Very good. So just building on some of the things that you've just discussed, I wanted to bring the conversation over to some of the work that's going on in the Broadway corridor and the Jericho lands, and the efforts that you and other partners have made on indigenizing some of these projects and working with land planners. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that process.
Yeah, the MST land acquisitions is something I'm tremendously proud of. In my career, 23 years working as a negotiator.
And let the audience know what MST stands for.
Yes, absolutely. So the MST are the Musqueam, Squamish, and Skszwx wú7mesh families here in Vancouver. We're part of the larger family known as Coast Salish, who are actually dissected in half by the Canada-US border. So we have a large group of Coast Salish language speakers. So the Musqueam, Squamish, and Skszwx wú7mesh are three of the families within the Coast Salish umbrella. Here in Vancouver, for many years, our families were really in a tug-of-war where we're in a space of competition over scarcity of resources. Because we had been relegated to our reserves, whenever there was a disposition of lands claimed by the Crown within our territories, the nations would all step in and immediately get into a tug-of-war, which resulted in 100% loss to the nations. So Sinclair Centre, Canada Post, there's a number of examples where we weren't successful in land acquisitions. It wasn't until we reframed our relationship from competition to collaboration, where we reaffirmed our kinship ties in our longhouses, that we were then able to forge a path forward in a place of unity and more collaborative. So we then developed the MST Development Corporation, which each of the nations are 33.3% each, so we're equal partners. And then we were able to jointly negotiate with the provincial government and the federal government in the acquisition of 120 acres of fee simple land here in Vancouver. Most notably, of course, is Jericho. Jericho is another ancient village known as Eyalmoch, but erasure has been very effective to make us invisible in our own land, where the average Vancouverite will run around down on the beaches there and go play volleyball and live this fantastic quality of life, while our ancestors are still buried down there. And when our ancestors are unearthed, they're subject to the archaeological branch to be put in museums, in drawers all over the world. So there's very little protection of our history and our rights and title of these unceded territories. So the nations really had to look at, again, how do we move forward to create a scale of economy. So the acquisition of 120 acres represents about $5 billion of land value in today's sort of zoning. As we move forward with zoning and density and phasing, these values will exponentially increase, really positioning the nations to be able to borrow against the projects, to draw from them, to have assets and long-term revenues, again, that we can reinvest into future projects and ongoing concern, but also reinvest into our communities.
Absolutely. And in some of this indigenization process that I've heard described by some of your teammates, they've talked about language and values and how to embed that into the process, but also in educating and bringing the rest of the working group together to understand these aspects. Maybe you can give a few examples of those.
Yeah, I think the branding is very important to me. You know, when we started negotiating a lot of these projects, as negotiators, we asked ourselves, why are we doing this if there's not a path for young people? If we're not immersing our young people in careers and opportunities, again, not to assimilate into this notion of Canadian society, but to really utilize the best tools available to us. And it was really these value chains that started to develop entrepreneurialism within the community. Again, being the first generation out of residential schools, this was new to us because our parents were systemically denied those opportunities to participate in mainstream economy. So we are playing catch up. And within that, what we've heard from our young people is branding is very important. Again, the naming of these buildings, the building envelope, the foyer when you walk in, every aspect of the projects, we want it to reflect MST culture, just as you would expect anywhere else in the world, where you walk into New Zealand, Aotearoa, or you go into Japan or wherever, you're going to see culture, you're going to see the brand explicit. So right now, there's really nothing around here that speaks to that other than YVR. When you walk in, you see great ambiance. You know, we did the signage on the Sea to Sky Highway, was one of my files pre-Olympics, 2010. Where we wanted to create visible presence through our language, that it's not French, it's not English, therefore it must be Indigenous. So it's really countering erasure in a variety of ways, and the developments are integral to that.
Thank you so much. So I want to move on to thinking about the audience that we have here. So we have a number of members in our audience that are venture founders. Most of the ventures that we have are really focused on impact. We have researchers that are here. We have mentors from our community and people from funding agencies and various groups. And for the last 2 years, we've been holding workshops in collaboration with our colleague Bob Chamberlain to help our venture founders to develop engagement strategies with First Nations. We have a lot of researchers and venture founders that are addressing issues around potable water, around affordable housing, around access to healthy food and energy security. And so I was wondering, for your opinion, if you can share with us what kind of advice you could give to startup founders around how can they participate in economic reconciliation with Indigenous communities.
Yeah, wonderful question. So first of all, my message to our friends here is we can't do it alone. You know, we're new entrants in the market. It's not necessarily the nation's core competency at this time. So scaling our nations, rebuilding our nation's governments while creating the economic development arms to limit liability back to the nation, to minimize political interference, are all these iterations of growth. But in that, there's ample opportunity to draw in partnerships where we need investors, we need people within the entirety. There's no one developer that can take on the entire land portfolio of the Squamish Nation alone. So we have lands in the Sea to Sky, we have lands in Whistler, we have lands over in the Sunshine Coast, and significant lands here in Vancouver. You know, we did bring in EMAR out of Dubai at one time to do some visioning and some master planning of a couple parcels of land, which really opened our minds to the possibility. And that open-heartedness really looks at the notion that it's not us and them, it's us. What is our collective vision by 2050? What is our collective vision by 2100? Where do you see yourselves affecting positive change? Certainly the road to net zero, as Crystal Smith of the Heisel would say, is through Indigenous lands. All of this is Indigenous land. There's no such thing as Crown land. So if you look at the court cases and the 225 rulings at the Supreme Court of Canada, most recent, of course, is Blueberry, but also Tsilcotina 2014. The courts continually reaffirm that Aboriginal title was not extinguished when BC joined Canada under Confederation. So that reality for Canadians also represents significant opportunity to work with nations, to create greater metrics of success, and dare to dream. You know, where do we see ourselves collectively? So the celebration of history and culture, often I hear a lot of Canadians saying, I don't know where I fit in that space. They're not adverse to reconciliation, but they really don't know how to take the first step and often are afraid to make mistakes. My advice is make mistakes, go forward. That's how we learn. I've made tremendous mistakes throughout my career, and it's always as our grannies and those that will continue to stand us up and certainly discipline us, but also teach us. And that's important, to be humble when you're working with a nation. It's important to know who is your audience, what do they care about, and how do you help solve problems. It's not about imposition of Western culture only, because we've seen the results of that for many generations, and it's time to do better and mature as a society.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to build on some of the themes that you've pulled out there. So you referred previously to the Indian Act and all the challenges. If you don't own a piece of land, you can't get security from the bank, so you can't get a loan, so you can't start a business. When we're looking at the traditional sort of business practices and investors, where they're, especially in Canada, our investors tend to be very conservative. They want to have a lot of low risk. And in circumstances where we're just starting to have more collaborations and partnerships between Indigenous communities and other groups, they might perceive there's a lot of risk here. We don't know what's going to happen with the land. We're not sure who has ownership. Can you talk a little bit about how we turn that into an opportunity?
Yeah, it's an excellent observation, and it's very true that it's a fear of the unknown. So as we remove ambiguity, a lot of our planning processes around land use planning, marine use planning, moving beyond sort of a litigious relationship to more negotiations and partnerships, is where we're going to start seeing this curve in attracting investment. And certainly nations have been creating a lot of structure across Canada, where you have someone like Harold Calla, doing the First Nations Financial Management Board. You see the First Nations Major Projects Coalition with NILO starting to move forward with empowering, providing toolkits to nations for negotiating, creating better outcomes. You're seeing Canada Council for Aboriginal Business creating toolkits and helping Canadians understand why economic reconciliation matters to all of us. I'm very interested in, of course, the financial sort of aspect of these projects. If we want equity in wood fiber, which we've negotiated the opportunity, how do we then attract that investment and make sure that it's attractive? When we bought our own lands back through Jericho and whatnot, we had to borrow a few $100 million to get these lands back. Even though there are lands, you have to look at, do we want to pursue treaty? Do we want to litigate? Do we want to negotiate? Do we want to exercise civil disobedience? Or do we want to be complacent and allow the cumulative impact of loss of and privatization of our lands? You have to weigh each of those opportunities and look at what will yield the best outcomes. So negotiations certainly have been how to implement the court rulings in a much more methodical and better tangible results, where again, this is something that Canadians can celebrate and move forward. I invite you to read Resource Rulers by Bill Gallagher, as well as another book is A Fair Country by John Ralston Saul. These are both fairly dated now, but they're excellent examples of how it is us together moving forward. So I find a lot of lenders, just to get back to your question, are interested in sort of these boutique NACA, for example, National Aboriginal Capital Corp, and others like that, are able to then disseminate those monies and loans and investments into communities specifically to provide better service to Indigenous peoples, where our default within those organizations is less than the average sort of the bank. So you're seeing really solid metrics and data that's being created from these entities, I think, that are going to help remove the boogeyman from the bushes.
Thank you. So I want to encourage people. Michelle had described and Shang had described how you could submit your questions on Slido. I'm just going to turn to see if we have some that are here, and we'll just have some of the audience questions now. All right, so I'm going to start with the first one. So how can we connect to First Nations to collaborate on innovative mitigation solutions on First Nation lands?
Yeah, it's definitely a work in progress. Thank you for the questions. With our Dev Corps, it's been really important, again, to structure our business entities. So many of the First Nations in Canada have development corporations that will be your first point of contact. They have a full sort of C-suite. They have their board of directors. It minimizes kind of the political interference, or it defines the roles and responsibilities. Within the Squamish Nation, for example, we do have senior managers that are responsible for partnerships. So they have a vetting process, they have a business registry, they endorse and greenlight businesses and partnerships that we can then plug into a variety of projects. So there's definitely a conduit and a pathway that we've been very cognizant of on how to attract people to work with, whether it's the nation or members within the nation, to plug them into just the volume and magnitude of projects that we're involved in.
Mm-hmm. Actually, just building on that, to take the example of the MST Development Corporation, when MST Development Corporation was developing their procurement processes and thinking about indigenization and the values that you wanted to use, because there's some power in that procurement process, because you get to decide which projects you want to go forward with, which contractors you're going to bring in. What was the philosophy and theory behind the procurement practices to reach the goals that you want to have?
Yeah, so procurement is definitely near and dear to my heart, and it's something that I continue to advocate in every project I'm involved in. And it's really about mobilizing our members within the community to participate in the benefits that derive from projects. They often are mentoring or learning from other businesses that have been in these spaces, whether it's electrical or whatever aspect of a project. It starts with subcontracting, it starts with mentorships, it starts with building their reputation and their experience and their safety records and whatnot, to really then build these businesses and make them flourish. So that's one of the metrics of success that I envision over the next 10, 15 years, is you're going to see a lot more of these businesses that have transferable opportunities within many of the development projects or industrial projects, ski hill development. There's just a number of areas that, we're only 4,000 members in the tribe. Again, we can't do it alone. We're reliant on creating space.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, just as I was hearing you speak about this, about the procurement process, I just wanted to highlight one of our ventures that went through Bob Chamberlain's training last year, which is Row Homes, who prefabricate very beautiful flat-packed homes that can be built in 4 hours. So you just prep the site, come in, you can bring it in on a barge, you can fly it in, you can truck it in, and you have a 2 to 3 bedroom home that you can have within a day. And so they have just done a demo project with 4 homes for elder housing and single parents with the local First Nations, and they're looking to expand that. And so they've been just very pleased that they could help address some of these issues. Let's turn back to the questions we have here. So here's the next question. So as we pursue economic reconciliation together, how do we marry the Indigenous worldview of wealth creation with that of the colonial capitalist worldview?
Yeah, thank you. I really think it's short, mid, and long term. So, the short-term opportunities are how do you move beyond transactional relationships to more long-term relationships. It really starts with a tangible project, a tangible opportunity where there's purpose and profit. From that, you gain trust, you gain partnerships. Indigenous governments are often thinking multi-generational. So when we're in forestry, we're thinking 90 years. When we're in hydro, we're thinking 40, 50, 60 years. When we're in LNG, these are 40-year terms. So we're looking at the entirety of pre-construction, construction, and operations to create a path and really start to build the capacity within each of those spaces to maximize success. So, when you're coming in and bringing in sort of real capitalist opportunities, capitalism isn't a bad word, but it could be wielded in many different ways that we've seen aren't so positive on, climate crisis and whatnot that we're all confronted with. So bringing in Indigenous worldviews, I think, in my opinion, helps balance the canoe to set our sights on long-term objectives. And then it takes commitment to take every step of the way. Nothing's a straight line. You're going to hit peaks and valleys along the way. Which is in any business an entrepreneur is going to have to be faced with. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think the example that Indigenous communities have made to be able to have that foresight, to be looking at multiple generations, is so important, because we can use the capitalist system as a chess game and figure out how we can navigate through that, but identify that we need to overcome barriers like election cycles that are short. and other pressures that are really in the short term, and also identify where there's regulatory or taxation issues that will actually incentivize cutting a forest down in the short term, because it has more value once you cut it than if it remains. But in fact, the long-term value for habitat creation, for cooling, for all these additional natural resources, natural assets we have, you need to look in that long-term period. Now, I think we're almost at time here, so I wanted to pass it back to Chang and to thank Chief Ian Campbell for joining us today. Thank you.
Oh, just thank you, everybody. One final word, if I may, is, we seen Elder Roberta this morning raising her hands in gratitude, saying OCM. If I can hear everyone say OCM. OCM. Beautiful, nicely done. But because we're engaged in big business now, we've changed it to ATM. Thank you, everybody. It's an honor to be here.